My name is Cris Dam. I'm an artist and also an art dealer.
I'm Tamara Kostianosky. I'm an artist working with textiles and mostly in sculpture.
I'm Lucia Meister. I mostly do installations, but also use other medium like photography and video.
I'm Elana Herzog. I use a lot of materials, particularly textile for many years, but also construction materials and other found materials to do work that engages architecture as well as individual pieces.
Well, I'm so happy we were able to meet here at Slack Gallery. I'm happy to have you over. This exhibition for me, it's a little bit different from other things that I've done. Like we were just talking off the record about blood and like the sort of like sinister aspect of beauty. And for a long time, I really kind of ran with that. It's not that I wanted to make art that wasn't beautiful. I just saw blood and the inside of the body as a site of beauty, you know, and of inspiration and creativity. So we're here in my space. Half of the stuff is already packed. I'm having an exhibition coming up soon, but some of it isn't. And mostly what you see on view here are two sculptures that are, one is finished and one isn't. This one is the finished one. It's a sculpture of a carcass, half a cow actually, like open in half. And what you're seeing in here is that the back side of the sculpture is pretty close to, you know, the anatomy of the real animal when it's cut up. But then in the interior, what we see is that a landscape of sorts starts to emerge. We see plants and flowers and vegetations and birds start coming up. There's a parrot in there, and this is work that has been inspired in the last 2 years, in which I have been paying close attention to the material culture of the colonial era and have been looking at how patterns and especially wallpaper designs were inspired by the landscape of the Americas, but with a lot of editing going on. This is an unfinished work from the series in which you see that there's also the visceral nature of the carcass on the right-hand side. And then on the left, we start seeing how the carcass metamorphosizes or transitions into a landscape of somewhat regeneration and rebirth. And that's sort of like the premise of these works. They are hung by really strong hooks, meat hooks, that I sort of scavenged the internet in order to find. And luckily I'm still able to. And there's that contrast between the softness of the sculpture and the textile work and the very masculine and hard ware that I use in the pieces. This one over here is probably the most ambitious to this day of this series, and in the sense that there's a lot of three-dimensional elements coming out of it. And I also was interested in like cutting up the picture plane so that it didn't appear as rectangular. You see that there's like a cutout space like at the top of the surface in there, just to make it more organic. And once again, we have the original wallpaper designs over here, which I trace with with great dedication and a lot of detail going into them. And vegetation in this case is sort of like taking over or like reconquering the decorative space. So I made works in the past of carcasses of birds, and that were very visceral and somewhat confrontational to the average viewer. This exhibition has a lot less blood than I've done in many, many years, and it's more engaging with sort of the decorative and ornamentation. I came to these like wall panels by making works that looked into the material culture of colonial America, and I was fascinated by the wallpapers that I found in my research. So these works kind of like respond to that. And if we go into colonialism, I think that there's like a genocide implied in there, and also like how negatively it affected the ecology of the Americas. And that's sort of like where the work is going to, but there's definitely a lot less blood.
I work in the kind of a same, or yes, period you were working on colonialism, or maybe before. which is at that time a colonialism in Latin America, when it was not yet called Latin America, but the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata and Alto Peru. And my interest is in bringing to the surface the names of women that fought in the independence wars. We only know, or we only have like very little information about them. So I work on that collective memory, bringing together fragments of memories. And each time we go back to memories, we refresh them and we recreate. They're not the same. So with those like new memories or refreshed memories, we can build different identities that are not fixed, and that's what I like. We can move them, change them, they're flexible. That's why my materials are like charcoal powder, talcum powder, fragments of like objects, and only a few like solid materials, like sometimes glass or aircraft cables, but usually things that I can bring together and build a whole or something that looks like a whole, but with little elements.
Sounds like you're talking about elements that can shift, that don't always have a constant form, and where composition is really not a fixed thing.
Exactly, there's always a flow, right? That is not, it's not fixed.
Yeah.
Maybe that comes from, since I remember, I traveled, I moved, so I'm used to things that are not really fixed, and I need that flowing thing in my life.
That's been an important thing to me in the work I do. I feel like I need to challenge the idea that composition and art objects have a kind of fixed identity that is perfect. You know, everything is, for me, about this kind of relationship between control and lack of control, and trying to push back on the idea that things can be right or wrong in what we do. And I think my feeling about beauty is also that it is something that contains so many experiences and so many emotions, and that taste and convention kind of drive what we think is beautiful as we're being, you know, as children, we get raised to like things or not like things, and there's so many unconscious indicators that have to do with class and sort of social status and culture that we interpret as making something beautiful or ugly. And I love being able to just take things that are mass-produced, are used, are tawdry, that I associate with poor taste, that I feel like I was taught not to like, and transform them into something that I feel is truly beautiful, but not necessarily in a conventional way, you know. So that's what drives me. I collect materials and I search communities and sources for mass-produced, used, tawdry things that kind of reflect a lot of different parts of our relationship to sensuality, to culture, to taste.
I see your work, Elana, dealing a lot with construction and deconstruction of, like, particularly your work with rugs that I love, amongst many other bodies of works, but this idea of taking a structure that holds together and that is known for having like a very precise, orderly fashion to its manifestation, and doing that, right? And sort of like what's missing, and in a way connecting to what you said regarding like the parts and fragments, right? I think that we can't, this idea of the whole, right? Of the wholeness of like a beautiful object is so far from our experience in the world, right? Because I think that very few people feel whole anymore. Like, I don't know if anybody ever did, but.
Well, I think there's instances where people feel whole, and I think that's kind of a combination of many things combining at one point. I think beauty is kind of like an ephemeral thing that can happen, and it's due to environment and also just other aspects of it too. It's not just, so I think beauty can be found in certain moments in life, or it's not
In experiences,
in
you mean?
experiences. So it becomes kind of an emotional thing. So
Something very abstract, actually. Right?
Yeah.
It's a concept that we built,
Yeah.
right?
Fleeting too, and we value it more
Yeah.
because it is fleeting. I mean, an entropic process is sort of applies to almost everything that exists, you know, and making that visible in the work, you know, is a part. And you made a reference to structure. I feel like for me, the aspect of deconstructing materials in what I do is also a way of analyzing their original structure and making it its residue visible. But I also think, for instance, that we are taught to want everything new, and everything that represents wholeness, or it represents our comfort, it represents comfort in life, and that we have an aversion to the signs of where they represent bad.
But in the signs of where there's like a memory, right?
That's
and there's
right.
a lived experience.
The stories.
Yeah, I work with a lot of discarded clothing in my work, and it mostly is my clothes, and people are still amazed that I still use my clothes, and how much clothes can a person have, and I'm embarrassed to say a lot. But it's not just my clothing, it's my son's clothing, and friends that donate clothes, and textiles from the home, and all these garments that have a life to them. Of course, there's like an attempt to drive them away from like the landfill, and an ecological concern that is very much central to my work, but also how to bring that memory of the material and recast it, and like see if this item that is considered garbage because it's stained or is no longer new can be like transformed into something regenerative in a way, or critical of our society, you know. So I think that working with materials that have that history, right, is very charged.
And it can function as a critique of consumerism to some extent, and the way that consumerism participates in the ecological disaster of excess, you know, and disposability.
with my work, I actually use materials that are mixed medium as well, but I use the light bulb as a material. So light and darkness, like chiaroscuro, which started with the Renaissance, is sort of a process of my work that I've been using for a long time, and that a lot of artists are inspired by the idea of darkness and light. Going to Turrell, Mary Kors, Keith Saunier, all these artists that kind of more relevant that have been using light and dark. So I kind of mix paint with light. I use mostly marquee light, so there's a lightness and a darkness, and they kind of play off of each other. My upbringing also played a lot with light and darkness. I was born in Alaska. I grew up in a place where the lightness and the darkness was very prevalent. So and then I moved to Spain. My mother's Spanish, so that also played a lot with my aesthetics. And then living in New York, just being inspired by these light artists also kind of had a big influence in what I do. So the lightness and darkness is definitely, blood is not a subject matter of mine, but the idea of eerie darkness and bright light is, the contrast is what interests me.
Yes, but you don't focus on what's, like in our culture we know that light is, there's good in light and there's no good in darkness, right?
Yeah.
You revert that.
Exactly, and I'm using actual light bulbs, so that kind of accentuates like the idea of light. So, and I think that people and animals and everything is, there's an attraction to light that is pretty obvious. When the lights are bright, everything flocks to it. It's just natural energy that brings things together.
It plays into our biological rhythms too. But it's so interesting too, because that whole subject can incorporate both sort of spiritual, psychological experience, but also just perceptual study that somebody like Albers would have been interested in. It bridges science and philosophy, I guess. And it makes, one of the things I've thought about in connection to this whole conversation is the idea of the sublime, which is defined to some extent as incorporating both like awe and fear and
Terror,
aesthetic
actually, is the word,
experience.
right?
Yeah, that aesthetic experience does include, mystery and anxiety and the unknown.
Also how we relate to beauty, right? Going back to how we started, right? Yeah. What is beauty? And beauty, I think, it has this like mystery. What is it, right? It has like both things together. Actually, in my current work now, I'm taking branches from the trees and I'm covering them with porcelain. So you don't see, it has another layer that covers the original object or thing. So because I'm talking about identities and who we are and how we remember and how we think, how we look at things, right? When we look at these new branches, we never think, oh, inside there is a real one. Maybe there's a new beauty because the feeling is the porcelain is like soft and like it has a silky touch, but then there is a roughness inside of it.
So how do you do the porcelain on the tree branches? Like you cast the porcelain and then attach it to the...
No, there's a porcelain that is a paste, and I covered just one
you
by
fire
one.
it?
No, because if you fire, you get the branch is not there anymore. You fire the wood. But I know some ceremonies that they work with plants or branches inside and do that. They do that process.
Right.
Yeah.
And one is forever. One lives forever.
Yeah.
Porcelain, and the other is biodegradable.
Exactly. But there's the beauty in decay.
Yes. And I've made pieces using logs, cut logs, so they show, the hand of the human intervention. And I've embedded textiles into their surfaces using staples in the manner that I've made a lot of other work in the walls or on panels. Again, it's that sense of decay, this idea that growth and decay are sort of partners in the production of lichen, for instance, and moss, which could be growing on a surface like a bark, and that they generate form, in a very classical way. That form is something that is generated by all kinds of force, whether it's destructive or constructive or taking away or adding.
When you say form, you mean life?
I mean form as in what we are making, what I'm making as an artist.
I recently discovered moss in my art. I was this summer in a residency in upstate New York, and I make a lot of tree logs as well with sculpture, and that series in particular was kind of inspired by the death of my father. I used his clothing, and it was all about memory and like a memorial to his life. But when I was in my residency, all the landscape of upstate New York was like covered in moss. It was very humid, and I just became fascinated by how to translate that in textiles. And I made only one experiment with that I'm proud of, and that's sort of what I'm looking forward to continuing next, is sort of the exploration of moss. There's something visually very attractive about the color and the texture. It's like, nature's best carpet, I guess.
It's like a microcosm too, right? It's like a world, another world.
And also there is something beyond your control.
Right. Yes.
Because yes, it grows or not, whether
and
you
the
want
form it takes is random, feels random, but it's not.
No.
Of course.
But also this idea that there's life growing out of death, or decay, right? Like that idea in particular, that there's always like this idea of regeneration in nature, and how, as you were saying, like dead trees can act as loci for like the creation of new life, right?
Yeah, I on the other hand, don't really use that many natural materials, so I kind of mostly store-bought new materials. Most of my work was on canvas, and now I'm just using panels, but and light fixtures to make my work. So it's kind of, electric light sockets and fixtures that kind of make my work happen. I created a body of paintings before, canvas paintings, And that's kind of one of the most difficult things that I have now, is just going into the studio and trying to look at a blank canvas and see how to activate it. So just thinking of other options is an interesting idea.
Do you combine the light bulbs with the paint?
Yeah, so combine light and paint. What I do is I normally have the panel ready, and I kind of do a composition, and then on the composition I designate where the bulbs go, and then I put the bulbs in and I paint when the bulbs are on, because the light and the paint play with each other. So there's kind of like this reflection, and the lights tend to pop when you use certain marks or certain paint. It's just this play between light and paint that I've been really focused on for the last, I think 2013 was the first time. It was like by coincidence, because they asked me to do a project using technology, and the only thing I can think of was a light bulb. So, because I'm like, yeah, I'm not very technically savvy.
Well, but that's the technology that changed the world, right?
Yeah.
Like light bulbs.
Well, there are so many artists now working with like biomaterials, and we don't know exactly how those materials will like develop in the future in a few years. But that's, as an artist, that's not our business, right? I think it's good that we take those materials or create those materials to see what happens as materials for new work. And personally, I don't mind if the work is not permanent. If it lasts only for a few years, it's part of the process of the work.
And it's worth challenging this idea of eternity as a measure of value in work.
Exactly.
I mean, that's kind of a myth.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
And a product of a kind of marketplace.
And there's some works that age better than others, right? Like, you know, if you think of like the history of painting, right? I think that a lot of classical painting has aged really well, and like even sort of like the oxidation of like the, you know, of the chemicals on it, like has worked, and some not so much. I don't know. I was looking at this show by Antonita Pierre. And I was thinking about, like, did that painting age well or not? I remember loving it when I was very young, and like he was like my art hero, like by all means. And
well, there is, I know it's still up, but the exhibition of Eva Hesse at the Guggenheim Museum, it is exactly about that, how they can have, after so many years, I think that the work was not shown, exhibited for 30 years, because they were trying to like rescue the materials. It's interesting how the decisions of how to do that is like the museum decisions. They take the decisions today, but maybe in 10 years from now, they think, okay, it was not, you know,
well, a lot of historic work, you know, is the foundation sort of takes responsibility for that, which, you know, they try to research it to their best ability. But it's true, there is an aging process with certain things, like patinas and on bronze sculpture, which take 30 years to kind of patina, like, or even like the Statue of Liberty, which has an amazing patina, which artists would have a really hard time recreating for however long it takes to get that patina. So there's a beauty in, I guess, in certain things age very well. And I think that actually also marks what is important in art history. What ages well sometimes, a couple hundred years from now, we'll be able to look at, or people will be able to look at and be like, that's something amazing.
What people like determines also what they determine ages well. I mean, think of the show at the Met now of the painted classical, you know, reconstructions of classical sculpture with paint on them.
Exactly.
And so many people who've seen that are horrified by what it looks like.
The Egyptian paintings, that's what you're talking about?
I think they're classical.
they're like Greco-Roman sculptures, right?
Yeah.
Because the originals had paint on them, and then like it was erased through the years.
We think
I haven't
of them
seen
as
it.
white. I haven't seen it.
Yeah.
But we think that they're supposed to be white or marble colored, but in fact they were brightly colored, so we're told. but nobody seems to like them.
I guess there's beauty in age too, which is an interesting concept. There's a beauty, I mean, you know, America is a fairly new country, but if you go to certain places, I mean, like Egypt, where you see how ancient things are, that's actually beautiful because the wear and tear is what makes it beautiful in a way.
Well, there's a kind of an underbelly to beauty and to sort of the sensual and to the sexual, the erotic. And I think that that is a part of the whole conversation too, that needs to be acknowledged, that, you know, there are things that we repress that we find attractive, things that make things attractive in the way that musk, the perfume musk, is both attractive and repulsive. I mean, like skunk musk, but it's the basis of perfume.
Beauty for me is something that it's a pursuit. I guess artists try to capture, and also the darkness as well, because one can't coexist without the other. And I think throughout life, there's moments where you experience beauty and you try to capture that visually or emotionally, and you try to bring that into the studio as much as you can, and to create something that will hopefully have that effect, not just on you, but other people.
I think in this idea of creating this dichotomy between beauty and ugliness, I'm sort of a little bit on the fence about that. I think that there is beauty in sort of aspects of life that are normally considered ugly, and I feel that kind of my chore or my mission has become really over the years to like present this other side to existence, and something visceral that normally has been dismissed as not being attractive as attractive. Like that's sort of like where I want my work to exist, really, in sort of like redefining that category or expanding what beauty means.
I see that beauty is intrinsically linked to eros, and that you mentioned that word, and I think that there is eroticism in beauty, and eroticism as destroying and taking what is destroyed to rebuild.
For me, aesthetic experience is something that contains elements of attraction and repulsion and anxiety and desire, and that in the visual world, materials carry so much emotional charge and so much information, and are really useful ways to construct relationships between sometimes very contradictory images, contradictory experiences that hopefully add up to an idea of beauty.